So today I want to tell you about why young audiences matter, and also give you 3 case studies as to what we're doing at the Australian Broadcasting Corporation to reach younger audiences. Now, I think with somebody who has a story to tell, radio has long been a fantastic way to reach an audience and to build a community. But now we're in a time where anyone can create content, anyone can reach an audience, anyone can create their own community. And that does change the playing field for us. And we have heard a lot about that across the conference. I've heard from so many passionate people at Radio Days who do want to see radio thrive into the future. And I guess I want that to happen as well. Everything that's amazing about radio to me is, it's the connection, it's the community, it's the talent. And that is something that I want to see resonate for the next generation. I do care a lot about the next generation, so my job is as Head of Innovation Lab for the ABC. Before that, I was running ABC Radio's digital team, where we launched the ABC Listen app. I've also been involved in commissioning podcasts and setting up ABC's first digital podcast stream. And I say that because I'm barely going to touch on audio today, but I know a thing or two about it, okay? And I think, 12-year-old me would be so excited about, being here rubbing shoulders with so many experienced radio professionals. Like, I was that annoying kid who was always ringing up every hour to the commercial station trying to win movie tickets. I knew all the presenters. I grew up and then started listening to the National Youth Network, Triple J, and also went on to, discover talk radio, discover podcasts. So radio's always been there for me. But I think for young people today, they don't necessarily grow up aspiring to be on the radio. They don't sort of aspire to be presenters, probably in the same way that our generation have. Now, a few years ago, hang on, let me get the clicker. A few years ago, we started doing research into younger audiences, and particularly into the behaviours of teens and tween audiences. So we surveyed over 700 people and interviewed about 8 of them. And what we found was that the ABC wasn't their top pick for content. They knew us, they didn't necessarily need us or want us. And we've also found that young adults are similar. They do certainly turn to us in a crisis, we know that. We had massive numbers throughout the pandemic. But in a world of endless content choice, streaming platforms, social platforms, that's the norm for them. And here's some of the comments that we got. So I think that, the concept of being, local media that with limited choice is something that's just not familiar to them. If you think of, say, a 16-year-old today, they were born after Facebook existed. They were probably a toddler when the streaming services came to town, both video and audio. So they don't have that same perspective of what does traditional media mean to them. But they really love personalisation. Personalisation in the short-form platforms, and so it's no surprise that we've been hearing a lot about TikTok at this conference. So what we've learned is that broadcast radio and TV is something that they see their parents using more than their peers, and on-demand isn't part of a transformation strategy. It's just how they get their content. So they're consuming content, they're hearing stories. They are connecting with community, doing all the things that we do with broadcast radio, but it tends to be more on global digital platforms, and it's led by talent who intimately know those platforms. It's kind of the way that young people find their people. So today's millennials and Gen Z, this slide to me really shows why it matters. We've worked out in Australia that in 10 years' time, those generations are going to form 68% of our audience. So if you kind of think about the media fragmentation that's happening, those behaviours aren't going to be undone. Those audiences are growing up with those behaviours and becoming a bigger part of the cohort that we're trying to reach. So, how do you reach these young people with your message when they are spending a lot of time on TikTok or Instagram? And how do you adapt and change? Well, that's where I've got a couple of case studies to take you through, but I don't want to disappoint. I don't have a silver bullet. I think if anyone's trying to sell you a silver bullet of this is how to reach young audiences, it doesn't actually exist. It's about a nuanced approach and picking and choosing the bits that work for you and authentically with your brand. So there's 3 areas of change that I want to take you through. So this is my team at ABC Innovation Lab. We're made up of strategists, producers, journalists, cross-functional teams, so engineers, content makers, all working in together. And these are the 3 areas that I want to take you through: changing the content, changing the platform, and changing the system. And again, they're not audio examples, but they're doing the sort of same job that I think audio does for its audiences. So this particular project, First Time Voters, was one that we did in partnership with the ABC News team. In May last year, there was a federal election held in Australia to decide who would be the next Prime Minister. And coverage of elections is a real strength for the ABC, so we wanted to lean into this to reach younger audiences. We also realised that there would be a cohort of people 18 to 21 who would be voting for the first time this election. So we set out to do a bit of research to inform the ideas. We recruited a broad group of people from that target audience to understand, their behaviours, their understanding of politics, their interest in voting, as well as some of their content and format preferences. And I came away, from hearing about that research, realising just how savvy this generation were with their media. They don't trust any source. They are constantly checking between one and the other. They assume everyone is biased. They didn't have a great deal of political knowledge. And again, probably not a surprise, but they liked short, easy, high-reward content. So from this research, we gathered a group of young people in the organisation who were also passionate about reaching young audiences and talking about political content, and generated some ideas. The result was a project called Politics Explained, and I'll play a sample for you of this. It went out on Instagram and YouTube, and the purpose was to really try to explain the kind of civics 101, like how does voting even work? Now let me introduce you to some Australian politicians.
It's called being a goddamn bloody adult.
You sit down, Griffith. This is cold. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Houses of Parliament are where life-changing laws are passed, and they're home to a bit of drama. The system can be a little bit complicated, but it affects your life in a really massive way. So how does it do that? There are 2 houses. So let's start from the bottom and work our way up. The House of Representatives is imaginatively called the lower house. The lower house is important because it decides who's in government. So basically, who's in power. It's where history is made. And where politicians wheel and deal so their party can run the country. How good is this? Everyone's learning. This is great. And in the lower house, you'll...
Okay, I'll stop that one there. But we certainly got feedback as well from older audiences that maybe didn't quite understand how the Houses of Parliament work, that was also a useful explainer for them. We were really happy with the outcomes. So just to put that 6.4 million views into context, the Australian population is about 25 million. So we were quite pleased with how that went, and also the feedback that we got from it. We did also translate it into Bahasa Indonesia and Chinese for those audiences, because there were migrants who would have been voting for the first time in this election as well. So what was the other thing I wanted to say about this? I guess that connecting the research through to what we then worked on with the news team. We changed the content because we realised that young audiences didn't want to follow the kind of minutiae of a political event. The daily news cycle can get really in depth with policies, and it has a lot of assumed knowledge from from weeks or years beforehand. So starting with those explainers not only meant that we were fulfilling a need for young audiences, but we've also created content that can be evergreen and used again, at least the substance of it. The style and the platform will probably change by the time another election comes around. All right, next one, changing the platform. So this one is about our TikTok incubator. Everyone's been talking about TikTok, for better or worse. We started keeping an eye on this in about 2020 because we saw that the growth was, really going up for particularly that teens and tweens audience. So we were keeping a watching brief on the platform, but also thinking, do we do dancing videos? I don't think so. That doesn't feel like us. But we also saw that content was starting to become more sophisticated as well. It was touching on different topics, not just dancing. And so that's when we wanted to get a bit more involved. We could see that the content was lo-fi, it was authentic, it was quick to turn around. And while it was video, it wasn't like TV. In fact, I think it does have a lot more in common with radio. Connecting with a single host, building a community, responding quickly to trends. It's all things that we do in daily radio. Now, to get up to speed really quickly in a big organisation, we proposed this approach a bit over 12 months ago now, and the purpose of this TikTok incubator was to onboard different teams, to have a bit of a sandpit to play, to test and learn. So teams would roll onto the account for 3 months. They'd either then bounce off because it wasn't working for them, they might spin off their own account, or some of them would just stay contributing to the ABC main account. It also allowed us to be flexible and agile to test, different content styles, different genres, and respond quickly to what was working and what was not. And, TikTok has become huge, but as with all social platforms, it might not be here forever. So we're thinking about this as a model for how can we make quick decisions next time a platform comes around as well. How can we train up a variety of people quickly with a single model? And again, the incubator itself was the research. It was about learning through doing, and that's what I've taken from so many of the presentations for young audiences here, that people are jumping in, making stuff and learning from doing that. And I think we have done most of these things as part of the incubator. And let me just show you what our content looks like. I guess what I want to point out here is that in our content on the TikTok incubator, our main account, we've been really trying to stay connected to our brand and connected to the things that we've always stood for. So on the left there is our really well-known election analyst, Anthony Green. We've got a food influencer who we got in as a creator, and in fact her content has the biggest of any of the creators we've had on platform, getting about 15 million views. Also touching on art history, Indigenous, science, regional. So topics that really matter to us and that really make sense for our brand. But what has been the single biggest TikTok we've had on the account so far? I'm equal parts proud and embarrassed to present to you. Mullet Fest.
I met a strange lady. She made me nervous. She took me in and gave me breakfast. And she said, "Do you come from a long time ago?"
I kind of really, really wanted one for a while, and then I'm just like, one day I'm just gonna get one.
So as you can see, our producer Emma packed a lot of joy and storytelling into only 20 seconds. And a story that was being covered by local radio in Canberra anyway. In the first 9 months, really important that we've kept the focus on 18 to 30-year-olds. I think there's a temptation when you're on new platforms for younger audiences. Older audiences start to go there. We all know how old the Facebook audience is now. There's a temptation to get bigger numbers and ageing up your content, whereas we've really tried to keep it as an under-30s platform. We've also been quite focused on views as a KPI rather than followers. And that was just based on so much content gets distributed via the For You feed, and that's not necessarily the people you're following. So the actual view count is what we've been caring about. And that comment on the right, I mean, that's kind of why we set up this approach in the first place. You know, it was somebody from one of our teams who, you know, usually you'd end up setting up dozens of accounts. They might end up not being used in a fantastic way, you know, efforts wane. This way they could try before they bought. All right, last one, and I think I've got 5 minutes, is the Talent Fund. And so this one is about getting in new talent to the ABC who are creators. And this is about, you know, the kids who say they want to be a YouTube star or a TikTok star when they grow up rather than a radio star. How do we fit them into our talent pipeline? So we really did want a way for promising young creatives to have a pathway into the ABC, even if they didn't fit that traditional mould, that they weren't doing an all-nighter shift or they weren't doing a breakfast producing shift, but they had talents that were beneficial to us. And again, this one has also been about jumping in and learning through doing. So we wanted to see if we could connect young audiences with the brand through talent that, you know, aligned with our brand. Could we attract that talent to the ABC when, you know, they can do it for themselves? Why would they want to come to us? And also, how would we turn that sort of, you know, short-form art history or sourdough influencer into something that might have a long-term outcome for the ABC? So I want to just play you a video from, this is Mary McGilvray. She amassed like 500,000 followers as Iconoclast, an art history TikToker. She happened to be from Melbourne, so we're like, do you want to do some stuff for us? And the answer was yes. And here's one of her videos.
I'm in Box Hill, a suburb of Melbourne, where the most important camping trip in Australian art history took place. Let me explain. Back in the 1880s, Box Hill didn't look like this. It looked more like this. You've probably heard of the French Impressionists. You may have even heard of the American Impressionists. But how much do you know about the Australian Impressionists? In the late 19th century, news of a hot new style of painting from Paris reached Australia, and Australian artists were all over it like a seagull on a hot chip. But the Aussie Impressionists didn't just want to copy what the French were doing. They wanted to create an artistic movement that was distinctly Australian. So they went camping, and not just in Box Hill. Arthur Streeton wrote, "We walked to Alphington and some days as far as Templestowe and Diamond Creek. We boiled the billy for lunch and tea, killing any snakes that came our way." The result of these camping...
Okay, I've got in snakes and mullets, so I'm ticking the list. And yeah, what we found is that talent really did want to work with us. They knew that it was a pathway to bigger commissions, whether it would be podcasts or even, you know, dramas, being a TV broadcaster as well. And they also just liked the credibility that our brand gave to them. They also saw their own personal numbers going up as part of being involved with us. And we have generated a lot of reach from getting in these creators as well. And as well as, so that the Mary clip I just played, she was an external influencer who'd already built up quite a big following. There's one other video I want to leave you with, is Tom Forrest, and he's had quite a long career with the ABC. He was a children's TV host, and he's been working in the ABC Indigenous unit, not on screen. But we noticed that on the side, he'd set up his own TikTok account, which was doing quite well, called Outback Tom. So we approached him and his manager and was like, do you want to do some stuff for us? Develop some new formats, develop some new styles, and he did. And he's been working really closely with our producer, Emma, given a lot of autonomy to create new formats, and has been sort of really successful on the account. So let me just play you a short clip.
How do young people go about dating in small country towns? I'm currently in Cunnamulla, in the middle of Queensland, and I also happen to be a young single bloke in Cunnamulla, Queensland. First thing I'll do is go for a walk through town and, I don't know, just see if I can find anyone, really.
The first challenge I faced is that town was dead quiet. There was no one really around town. So I went into the local op shop.
Hello.
There were a few antique items, but no prospect of a date. I went to the local cafe, small country town, no one really there. I decided to read a book from the Twilight Saga in hope to attract someone potentially more alternative. And after 15 chapters, I had no luck. Then I ran into Jerry.
Jerry, how do you think young people could go about dating in a small town like Cunnamulla?
Okay, well for me, I like to pick up young boys myself. Are you available?
So it's the street. Maybe it's just the street.
Turned out Jerry was joking and has kids my age. So I downloaded the popular dating apps. To my disappointment, there was no one there. I finally got some advice.
Just ran into Cunnamulla local. His name's Jabs. Jabs, for young people in Cunnamulla, where do you go for dating?
Let's go down to the pub, mate.
Down to the pub?
Yeah, mate.
I'll give it a go.
I made it to the local pub, however most of the patrons were married, retired and enjoying a simpler life in regional Queensland. I was finally defeated. But sometimes that is journalism. Through hardship I learnt that maybe it's not always about finding a partner. It was a valuable lesson learned. Learning to spend time by myself, enjoying my own company. And through this journey I got myself out in the community, exploring and meeting the locals of outback Queensland. But also if you have any advice, just put it in the comments if that's alright. Just for other people, obviously not for me.
We love Tom. He does such fantastic work on the account. And I guess just one last point on the Talent Fund would be that we're sort of switching up the production pipeline. So rather than thinking of social or TikTok as being after the radio or after the TV and as a way of promoting, how can it be at the front? How do you get people in who are creatives with great stories to tell, get them to tell them on the platforms that they're good at, but then think about how they can do things on radio too. So we've got from this cohort, one is doing a podcast pilot for us at the moment, another one's hosted a major TV event, and another is doing a regular TV spot. So it can go the other way as well. All right. Lastly, the key takeaways. So be persistent but patient. You're not going to win overnight, but if you know you're doing the right thing, stick with it. And also be agile. And I like to think of it as like catching a wave. And, is the TikTok wave about to crash? Do we need to be like about to get off this wave so we can catch the next one behind it? Being supportive of young people is so critical in this. This is the audience you're trying to reach. They're the people with the ideas. How do you make space for them to make decisions? And lastly, really be true to your brand, because a lack of authenticity will come through to the audience. So what are the things you stand for? Who are the young people who can take them to your audience? Thank you. And I will leave you with, if you've finished taking photos of that one, yes, I will leave you with a QR code, because that seems to be the thing to do here. We've written up some of this work on the Innovation Lab blog, so if you want to read more, you can grab that. Thank you so much, and I'll see you all for drinks.
Thank you so much, Angela. If you will have some questions, remember them, because we will do the questions at the end. And now let's please welcome the guests from BBC. It's Grace Jasper and Anisha Ratan, and they're going to present together.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for sticking with us, and thanks to Angela for such a great presentation. So it's really great to be here today. So we're going to talk to you about young audiences in audio, but we're going to look at some of the trends across live radio, on-demand music and podcasts for how our young audiences are listening in the UK. So I'm Anisha. I work in audience research at the BBC, and my focus is on our youth music radio brand. So that includes BBC Radio 1, which is a mainstream music station which is focused specifically on our 15 to 24-year-olds.
And I also work in the BBC Audiences team. I'm Grace. I'm the Insight Lead on Radio 4 and BBC Sounds. So first up, a bit about 15 to 24s. When we're talking to young people across the UK, we hear time and time again that things feel fluid, unclear and unpredictable. They value content that helps them navigate this uncertainty that's surrounding them. And those at the Youth Summit would have heard yesterday, this audience are more tapped into their mental health than any generation before them, and the need to look after it. And our research shows that media has a key role in comforting audiences at this time. Watching or listening to content is the top things that audiences claim to do when worried. And that's when you have builds that you don't click on. On to the next slide. So since 1998, we've grown up with digital media, well, this audience have grown up with digital media fully established and a plethora of choice. There's an unlimited supply of readily available content. And in line with audiences moving increasingly online, we at the BBC launched the iPlayer in 2007, as you can see here, alongside the likes of Netflix, and BBC Sounds in 2018. But what I find is really interesting is that despite this influx of media providers and tech giants, when looking at how audiences are consuming content, at its broadest level, it's actually a portrait of consistency for young audiences over the past half a decade. Patterns of listening are generally similar. As we can see from this chart, actually audio peaking at 5 p.m, typically in 2015, 2020, and visual at 9:30 p.m. However, we have seen an uplift over time in terms of the reach for audio. As this purple line show, actually, audio has become more important than ever in daily habits across the day. And I think some of us in the room probably know very much why that is. We've seen podcasts really boom in this time, but also audiobooks have really grown in terms of their reach, alongside, of course, the stronghold of radio and on-demand music.
Thank you. As Grace has said, a lot has changed in the audio space. So we're going to talk through some of the trends now for 15 to 24s, and also talk about some of the challenges that we face reaching this audience, and what we've done at the BBC using BBC Sounds, which is our digital audio offer, to sort of adapt to that changing landscape. So starting with live radio, and hopefully quite timely to start with this slide, as I know Czech Radio celebrates its 100th anniversary this year, but also at the BBC we celebrated our centenary last year, which also means for us 100 years of radio. So it's really great that at an overall level, when we look at our data from Radar, which is the UK's official body for measuring radio audiences in the UK, we see that live radio really holds strong, reaching 9 in 10 UK adults 15 plus every week, spending over 20 hours on average with us. But it's safe to say that when we look at the picture for 15 to 24s, it's a bit more of a challenge. Weekly reach with this audience has seen decline over time. I do want to emphasise here, though, that radio still remains incredibly strong for this group and incredibly important. It reaches more than 3 in 4 of them weekly. And it also means it's their biggest audio source in the UK, and that's ahead of music streaming for this audience, which I'll talk about in a bit. But so whilst radio is a clear touch point, we see that potentially the relationship with radio is loosening. They're not coming in quite as frequently. So our challenge is sort of retaining that habit with them and bringing them in more often. So just switching tracks a little bit to think about how our audiences are listening, which I think is key to understanding how we can keep bringing them in as we go forward. And as people have talked about, throughout the conference, we do see a shift to our audiences coming to us online, so through internet-connected devices, whether that's on web, on app, but also on smart speakers increasingly. And this change does look to be sort of led by our younger listeners, and it's something that we saw sort of happening before COVID, but also continuing and actually maybe even accelerating off the back. The chart on the left here shows for 15 plus that around 1 in 4 hours with radio each week are consumed on an internet-connected device, but that goes up to nearly a third for 15 to 24s, so a really important place for them. However, if we look on the right-hand side of this slide, we also have to think about the importance of some of those more traditional platforms, and I think in-car is a key place to think about those, where potentially fewer people have access to internet-connected devices. And actually for 15 to 24s, in-car is so important, nearly 1 in 3, so 28% of our listeners there are only consuming content in-car. So a place that we really need to kind of protect as a radio occasion as we sort of see changes through in the future. In terms of what they're listening to now, so in the UK, we see that the majority of time spent on radio for 15 to 24s is with our music stations, 86% of all those hours to national music radio, in fact, which compares to 2 in 3 hours for adults overall. And at the BBC, we've got BBC Radio 1, which is the biggest station in the UK for 15 to 24s. It reaches more than 1.7 million of them weekly. But we also can see here that other sort of mainstream music stations are really coming through and cutting through with this audience, so the likes of Capital and Heart from Global, but also our own BBC Radio 2. In comparison, if you look a bit further down that chart, our speech stations, so BBC Radio 4 and 5 Live, still doing well and reaching over 400,000 weekly listeners, but a little bit further down that list. So why is it that we still see 6 million 15 to 24s coming to radio every week? What is it that they most value? And when we do research with this audience, we hear time and again about that sort of effortless, curated listen that radio offers them is what kind of brings them back. It can cater to their mood and need at the flick of a switch or just with a few words to their smart speaker, but it also provides that structure to their day. But beyond that, I think really important to mention those elements of companionship, light-hearted entertainment, which kind of give that sense of connection, whether that's to the presenters or whatever's happening on the show. I think that middle quote sums it up quite nicely. Radio is nicer than Spotify because there's a human at the other end. But also we hear from our young listeners that the value of radio really helps in those sort of social situations. It provides compromise, whether that's when they're listening in car or with friends, because what it does is it provides an opportunity to avoid judgment from others, which they might get if they turn on their own music streaming and their own playlists. As well, what we also see, that sort of an element that really stands out and something that we focus on a lot at the BBC and with Radio 1 in particular, is those elements of liveness, whether that's on air or on the ground. So there's some examples here on the left that Radio 1 has done. I won't talk through all of them, but just to touch on that top one. So Greg Danes is our breakfast presenter on the weekdays, and he has been the subject of many, many antics on Radio 1 over his time. Last summer, we challenged him, well, basically his show got taken away from him by another presenter, and he was challenged with finding pieces of a jigsaw which are hidden across the width and breadth of the UK with help from the listeners, and he had to get those before he could have his show back, and it took a few days, so he really was invested in that. But also beyond those on-air moments, we see the importance of reaching young audiences on the ground. We know that they're not always going to come to us, we have to go to them, and a number of our shows will deliver their shows from different locations in the UK, but as well as that, we've still got our big sort of music events, such as Radio 1's Big Weekend, which is a music event which happens annually, focused on music artists, really appeal to that 15 to 24 audience. So this year it's taking place up in Scotland, in Dundee. But the other sort of element of liveness that we really see as a draw for our young audiences is through sport. And actually nearly half of 15 to 24 speech radio listeners in the UK are only listening to stations which have an element of sport in them. And that's in comparison to 1 in 4 overall. And what that does, live sport on radio enables us to sort of our listeners to stay up to date with the latest scores and moments that they don't want to miss out on. And we've got BBC Radio 5 Live here, which provides pre-match commentary, sort of building up that anticipation, but as well as that post-match analysis to kind of help make sense of the results. So any football fans in here, the recent 7-0 loss that Man U suffered to Liverpool is one such example. I had to make sure I got that the right way around because I don't know so much about football. But moving on now to on-demand music. So I think this kind of graphically sums up the picture for where we are with that. So whilst live radio reaches more 15 to 24s every week than any other audio type, the majority of their time spent now is with on-demand streaming services. So the chart on the left is for adults 15 plus. You can see that dark purple area of the chart, that's live radio, 68% of their time spent in the week. So it's still the majority. But on the right, you can see that reduces to just a third for 15 to 24s. And in fact, over half their time is now spent with music streaming services. And that has come at the expense of live radio, and we've seen that number creeping up over time. But I should also just mention here that when we talk about streaming services, we're talking for the most part about Spotify, which is where our young audiences are spending the majority of their time with streaming. So what is it? So when we speak to our young audiences, we know that those elements of choice and control are the main draw for them, and that links to what we know about how audiences use music to really match their mood. And it often means that music streaming services are their top of mind option when thinking about music. And a survey that we did recently told us that 2 in 3 agreed. It also provides a destination for music discovery, but actually increasingly it's part of a network of sources, and TikTok's been mentioned a lot, but definitely a place that young people are going, as well as YouTube and of course radio. But all of this shows that the on-demand music space is very, very established and crowded. It's a difficult area for us to compete. So what we need to do at the BBC is to think about what our USP is here and how we can cut through with young audiences in this space. So I'm going to pass over to Grace now for some examples.
Great, thank you. So yes, one of our strengths as the BBC is our linear brands, but we also have on-demand brands that cater to specific needs. So there are parts of our schedule where the live nature of our content is less important, and segments that can easily be lifted out of linear and served up in the on-demand space. This also means if our audiences miss Radio 1 anthems that week, they can catch up with it on demand, perhaps on that Friday night. And we are using the unique leverage of our well-known and well-loved youth brands to really build this familiarity and represent high-quality mixes that they can listen to on demand. We also have a clear on-demand first offer to cater to different needs and moments that live radio might not necessarily cover. So these can be TV moments, so a complement to our big award-nominated shows such as Normal People. Or they can be nostalgia and throwback. We know how popular that is. Sounds of the 90s is an on-demand first brand and an on-demand only host in Fern Cotton, a presenter who was well-known and well-loved on TV during this period and in the noughties. And then finally, I talked a bit about mental health, and that this audience is more aware of how they need to keep an eye on their mental health and take time out to do so. And we have deliberately, as a result, created music mixes such as the sleeping forecast. We also have mindful mix to make sure that they can do so at a time that's most convenient to them. And also, when you're going to sleep, sometimes live radio is a bit of a risk. You don't necessarily know what you might get on. And this offers really the audiences the control and the safety to know that they're listening to a playlist that is what they need at that time, and hopefully will help them get a good night's sleep. So, meanwhile, our commercial radio, mood and genre-based brand extensions tap into on-demand habits for finding music. So I thought it was important to give these a shout-out because Glow and Bauer really do a good job at using their sub-brands to tap into a popular genres of audiences. So this can be dance, upbeat, and then this can also be chill, so those looking more to unwind. And I think we're increasingly seeing audiences searching by mood and genre, especially this audience. So this is really key for them when they're in the discovery mindset. Right, so now moving from on-demand music to on-demand speech. So as Anisha mentioned, we've had 100 years of the BBC recently. That's 100 years being the home of speech in the UK. And podcasts offer us the chance to continue this legacy alongside speech radio in a space where we're not tied to the restrictions of broadcasting formats. We're adding that element of greater choice and greater control than the live environment provides. And what's really pleasing to see is that podcasts have seen the highest growth rate of the three audio formats we're talking to you about today in the past 5 years for 15 to 24s, at 1.8 million weekly listeners. They've more than doubled, up by 141%, versus for our on-demand music services, which is up by 27%. And we're addressing this at the BBC by experimenting at pace with a number of things on BBC Sounds to engage this younger generation of listeners. And what I find particularly exciting is the fact that it's introduced speech audio to a completely new audience that may have never engaged with us before. So 1 in 5 15 to 24 weekly podcast listeners are not listening to any radio, and 4 in 5 are not listening to any speech radio, which makes sense, right? Because prior to this, younger generation, aged into speech radio and the likes of Radio 4, which, whilst brilliant at catering for its audience, was not built with the likes of Gen Z in mind. And with this audience listening to on average 2 podcasts a week, we can really see that offers the opportunity to offer 2 more listening occasions through the BBC and build habits earlier. Our previous analysis that we've done into habits shows that habits built in youth tend to stick for life. Therefore, there's a really positive future ahead for podcasting. However, we have to work harder to get podcasts right for them. You might immediately assume that podcast listening skews young, and therefore is the biggest listener group are found amongst 15 to 24s. But actually, whilst this is being driven by younger listeners, it's not the youngest. What we've seen is that 15 to 24s are actually the smallest cohort under the age of 45 in terms of their share of listening. 25 to 34s remain the biggest demographic listening to podcasts, followed by 35 to 44s. Therefore, there's more opportunity to grow podcasting with this audience. So how do we do this? In a crowded market where they are really sport for choice. We've recently launched a BBC podcast tracker in-house, and these are three key findings that I think are really interesting. Half pick and choose based on topic or guest, rather than a series just because they like it. Therefore, to cut through, we really need to make a title, the image, the first 30 seconds work harder to draw them in. And audiences love to chop and change, especially this one. Half have listened to a particular podcast for less than a month, and they're significantly less likely to have listened to a podcast for more than 6 months. So obviously, at this stage of your life, it's changing quite rapidly, but still, we can't assume an audience will be loyal to a podcast. We need new ways to bring them back in. And finally, I'm sure you've all seen this message on Netflix. I'm guilty of seeing it one too many times. And binging isn't only restricted to video. Audiences are more likely to binge a podcast title. So we need to ensure that we're providing onward journeys for those that complete a title quickly and keep them within the BBC. Ultimately, they're not going to hang around on platform waiting for our next big title. So we also, to combat this challenge of building relevance with these listeners, looked at need states, and this is a really important way to assess appetite. So using our podcast tracker again, we found that podcasts fulfill particularly passive need states for young listeners, alongside more active ones. So entertainment, as we can see, is still the top reason to listen for both 15 to 24s and all adults. But the need to unwind and their desire to listen to podcasts to pass the time comes through more strongly for this target audience. And that's unsurprising, given that we know they're more likely than all adults to have them on in the background or whilst multitasking. So, as a result, we've made it so that our podcast offering for younger audiences taps into this need for easier entertainment. The need to serve more lean-back need states than traditional speech audio on the BBC might typically offer. These podcasts are still most definitely entertaining and engaging, but they don't require the heavy concentration. There's something you can put on in the background, easy to tune in and out of. And for those of you who were at the Youth Summit yesterday, you'll be very familiar with these titles, but these are two excellent examples of podcasts that have done this really well. The first one being 6 Degrees with Jamie and Spencer. So this is an entertaining idea on the 6 degrees of separation. So the fact that all people are 6 or fewer social connections away from a call, essentially, or getting to know them. So this launched in 2020 and has seen ongoing success on BBC Sounds. And recently they've managed to do 6 Degrees with Paul Rudd and Hugh Grant. And Brown Girls do it too. This is another duo, as we can see. And what I love about this podcast is not only is it entertaining and fulfilling the more passive need states of hearing almost your friends chatting in the background, but it also goes that one stage further and helps break down social taboos. For most Asian girls, chatting about sex is off limits. However, this podcast really celebrates friendship, love, and sex, and therefore brings this topic to a new audience who might also be going through something similar. If you want to hear more about these podcasts, I can talk to you about them at the end, but for now, back to Anisha.
Thanks, Grace. And just really quickly, just to kind of touch on just some of those quick summary points and our key takeaways across the 3 areas now. So just quickly, live radio, as we said, biggest listener volume amongst this audience versus other audio formats, reaching over 3 and 4 15 to 24s every week. But we know we can't be complacent, and we must continue to remember the reasons that young audiences are choosing radio, be that matching a mood, that company and friendship, but also those elements of liveness, and keeping those really fresh and exciting, and reminding our audiences what radio can offer that other audio platforms can't. We know the element of choice and control for on-demand music means that 15 to 24s now spend more of their time there than with any other audio type. But we can leverage our well-known and well-loved brands, and we've done that at the BBC to extend our audiences into the on-demand space using BBC Sounds. And as Grace talked through some of those examples, so matching a mood or a need and occasion, having content available for them any time and any place. And then finally, podcasts, a really exciting area for young audiences, and they've seen the biggest growth across these 3 audio types for 15 to 24s. But again, it's about providing those relevant and really relatable conversations which give us a chance to reach young audiences with podcasts who we might not have spoken to previously through our kind of traditional speech radio stations. And that's it from us today. So thanks so much for listening on. Women didn't need to be behind the podium. You're like looking at the mic being like...